The letter was already in my hand when my sister walked into the room. I had been standing in the corner of the probate attorney's office for what felt like a very long time, though I know now it was only about 4 minutes. My fingers were holding the paper, but my brain hadn't fully caught up yet. The words were there, the legal language, the signatures, the notarized stamp in the bottom left corner, but my mind kept sliding off them like water off glass, refusing to absorb what I was reading. I had to start again from the top.
Twice.
3 times. My mouth had gone completely dry, and somewhere in my chest, something had begun to collapse the way old buildings do. Not all at once, but in stages, the structure giving way from the inside out. And then the door opened, and there was my sister Celeste. She was wearing a cream-colored blazer. Her hair was pulled back. She looked, as she always looked, completely composed. She looked at me across the room, and her expression didn't change, even slightly. No guilt. No hesitation. She sat down in the chair across from the attorney's desk, crossed her ankles, and folded her hands in her lap, and said, "I'm glad you're finally here, Hannah. I was worried you were going to make this harder than it needs to be." That was 3 years ago, and I still remember the exact sensation in my hands, the way my fingers tightened around that paper until the edges cut into my palm. I remember thinking, she actually believes she's going to get away with this. She almost did. But let me take you back to where this all began. My name is Hannah, and this is my story. I grew up in a house where love was a resource that felt perpetually scarce, the kind of home where you learned early to be careful about how much you needed, because needing too much was dangerous. My mother, Eleanor, was a complicated woman. That's the diplomatic version. The honest version is that she was brilliant and cold and deeply, profoundly unfair in ways she never seemed to notice or acknowledge. She had 2 daughters, me and Celeste, for years between us, and from the very beginning, we were sorted into roles so clearly defined that they might as well have been written on signs hung around our necks. Celeste was the beautiful one, the charming one, the one who got invited to things, who made friends easily, who walked into rooms and made them warmer just by being there. She had my mother's bone structure and my father's laugh, and she used both with extraordinary skill. I was the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who figured things out, who fixed things, who stayed. I was the daughter who drove my mother to her chemotherapy appointments when the cancer came the first time at 63. I was the one who called the pharmacy and kept the spreadsheet of medications and sat with her through the nights when the nausea was bad enough that she couldn't sleep. I wasn't resentful. I want to say that clearly. I loved my mother. I chose to be there. But choices made out of love are still choices with costs, and mine cost me years. I had a life I was building in parallel.
I want you to understand that.
I wasn't simply the caretaker with nothing else. I had a small landscape architecture firm I'd started in my early 30s, just me and 2 junior designers, working out of a studio apartment I'd converted into an office. I had clients. I had projects I was proud of. I had a small, real life. I had a man named David who I loved steadily and honestly for 6 years, who proposed to me over a very ordinary dinner on a very ordinary Tuesday, and I said yes without any drama, because that was who we were to each other. Ordinary in the best possible way. The kind of ordinary that feels like home. And I had my father's will. My father, Gerald, had died when I was 27 and Celeste was 23. He was a contractor who built things well and saved money quietly, and owned 2 commercial properties in a mid-sized city that he never talked about with any kind of pride or importance. He just had them. He bought them young and held them, and by the time he died, they were worth considerably more than he'd ever acknowledged. His will was simple. The 2 properties were to be sold upon my mother's death, and the proceeds split equally between his 2 daughters.
Half to me.
Half to Celeste. It was clean. It was fair. It was exactly what he would have wanted. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until 3 years ago, standing in that attorney's office holding that letter, was that 6 months before my mother died, someone had gotten to her. I need to tell you about the months before she died, because this is where everything began to quietly unravel, though I couldn't see it yet. The cancer came back when my mother was 71, and this time it was different. She'd had 8 years of being fine or fine enough, and then suddenly she wasn't. The treatment options were fewer and less optimistic, and the doctors used words like palliative and quality of life in that careful way that means they've given up without saying so. She came to live with me.
Of course she did.
Celeste lived 40 minutes away, and she was so busy, which she always was, which I had learned over decades meant that she would show up for the parts of things that were pleasant and graceful and leave before the parts that were hard. Celeste visited on Sunday afternoons. She brought flowers. She sat with my mother in the living room, and they would laugh together, and my mother's face would change in a way that was painful to watch, because she looked happier in those 2-hour visits than she ever looked with me. I know what you're thinking. I thought it too, more times than I want to admit. I thought. She loves Celeste more. I thought it on bad nights when I was exhausted down to my bones, when I'd been doing laundry and managing home health aides and coordinating with hospice, while Celeste sent flower arrangements and said things like, "Let me know if there's anything I can do." But I decided a long time ago that I wasn't doing it for the reward. I was doing it because it was right, because she was my mother. I carried that decision with me like a stone in my pocket, smooth from being held so long. She died on a Wednesday morning in April, quietly, the way some people are lucky enough to go. I was in the room. Celeste arrived 40 minutes later. 2 weeks after the funeral, I got a call from a probate attorney named Martin Greer. I didn't know him. My mother's estate planning had been handled by her longtime lawyer, a man named Fletcher, who'd been doing it for 20 years. But Martin Greer introduced himself as the attorney who'd filed an updated will on my mother's behalf 6 months prior. I asked him to repeat himself.
He did.
He said the new will superseded all prior documents. He said I should come in at my earliest convenience to review the terms. He said it in the careful, neutral tone of someone who is used to delivering information that will rearrange people's lives. I went. I sat down across from him. He gave me the letter first, a letter my mother had allegedly written herself, explaining her reasoning. That was the letter in my hands when Celeste walked in. And the reasoning, the explanation my mother supposedly gave, was that I was the financially stable one. That I had my firm, my life, my David, my future. That Celeste had always struggled more. That the properties, both of them, should go to Celeste in full, because Celeste needed them more. And then there was the other part, the addendum, the part that made my hands shake. The addendum stated that based on recent financial disclosures provided to Eleanor, my mother, it had come to her attention that I'd been drawing from a joint account my parents had established years earlier, an account I'd been listed on as an authorized user specifically to help manage household expenses during my mother's care. The addendum stated that the amounts withdrawn were inconsistent with stated expenses. It stated that Eleanor had become concerned about Hannah's financial motives and had decided to adjust the inheritance accordingly to protect the estate. I had withdrawn money from that account. Thousands of dollars across 18 months. Every cent of it documented. Every cent of it spent on my mother's care, medications not covered by insurance, home health aides, medical equipment, groceries, the hospital bed we had to rent. Every withdrawal had a receipt. I had kept them all in a manila folder because I am the kind of person who keeps receipts, the kind of person who accounts for things carefully, because I'd always known that being responsible means being able to prove you were responsible. But my mother hadn't known that, because somebody had fed her a story. Somebody had gathered the raw numbers, just the withdrawals, no receipts, no context, and brought them to my mother in her final months, while she was frightened and sick and perhaps not as sharp as she had once been, and told her that her responsible daughter was stealing from her. Celeste sat across from me in that cream blazer and said, "I'm glad you're finally here, Hannah. I was worried you were going to make this harder than it needs to be." I set the letter down on the attorney's desk. My hand was very steady. I don't know how, but it was. I looked at my sister. This woman I had known my entire life. This woman I had sat next to in the back seat of our parents' car for years of Sundays. This woman whose hair I had braided and whose secrets I had kept and whose heartbreaks I had listened to at 3 in the morning more times than I could count. And I said, very quietly, "Did you do this?" She held my gaze.
She didn't blink.
She said, "Mom made her own choices, Hannah. I think you need to respect that." Not a denial. Do you notice that? Not a denial. I walked out of the attorney's office without signing anything. I walked to my car, and I sat in the driver's seat, and I called David, and when he answered, I opened my mouth to tell him what had happened. And instead what came out was a sound I don't have a word for. Not crying exactly. Something older than crying. Something that lived below the level of tears. David drove to where I was and sat with me for 2 hours in that parking garage, and I let him hold my hand, and eventually I told him everything. He was calm. He was kind. He said we would fight it. He said we would find a lawyer. He said it in the solid, dependable way that was exactly who David was. I believed him. We both believed it would be straightforward. It wasn't. The months that followed were among the worst of my life. My grief about my mother. The real, complicated grief, the kind that doesn't sort itself neatly into sadness, had no room to breathe because I was immediately consumed by the legal fight. I hired an estate litigation attorney. I submitted all of my receipts. I submitted bank records, pharmacy records, invoices from the home health agency, every piece of paper I'd kept in that manila folder. I was certain, the way you're certain of something when you know the truth is on your side, that the documentation would simply end it, that anyone who looked at the evidence would understand. But Celeste had been preparing too. What I didn't understand yet was how prepared she was. She had statements from 2 of my mother's former friends, women I'd never had problems with, women who had come to the house and seen my mother happy and comfortable, saying that my mother had expressed concern to them about money. She had a letter from a therapist my mother had seen during her final year, a letter that said my mother had expressed anxiety about financial manipulation. She had, somehow, gotten to my mother's doctor, who provided a statement saying that my mother had, during one appointment, expressed confusion about household finances. None of it was a lie, exactly. That's what made it so devastating. It was a portrait assembled from true fragments and arranged to tell a false story. My mother had expressed concern about money because Celeste had been whispering worries into her ear. My mother had expressed confusion about finances because she was 71 years old and dying, and someone had deliberately complicated the picture for her. Everything was technically true and completely dishonest. The legal process dragged. Every month, more fees. Every month, my attorney said things like these things take time in a way that meant they were also expensive. I was spending money I didn't have, and the firm, my small, beautiful firm, the thing I'd built, was beginning to suffer because I had no bandwidth left. I lost 2 clients I'd had for years because I missed deadlines. I lost a potential project that would have been the biggest thing I'd ever done because I couldn't focus, because every time I sat down to design something, the legal paperwork was stacked at the corner of my desk, and my brain kept sliding toward it the way a compass slides toward north. And then David. I don't want to make David the villain, because he wasn't. He was just a person who had a limit, and I had exceeded it. The engagement had been a quiet thing when we announced it, and it became a quiet casualty when we ended it, but quiet doesn't mean painless. He said about a year into everything that he felt like he'd lost me. That he came home every night to someone who was present in body only, someone fighting a war he couldn't join and couldn't help with, someone who had stopped laughing. He said it gently. He said he still loved me. He said he didn't know how to help me anymore. I understood everything he said. I also couldn't fix it. And so he left, not dramatically, not cruelly, just honestly and sadly, and that loss on top of everything else was the thing that finally broke me open completely. I remember the night I got the news that the court had ruled on the preliminary motion, a procedural decision, not even the main case, but one that went against me and meant the process would take even longer. I was sitting on my kitchen floor. I don't know how I got there exactly. One moment I was at the table, the next I was on the floor with my back against the cabinets, and my hands were pressed flat against the tile because the cold of it was the only sensation that felt real. I was crying in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child. The gasping, ugly, whole body kind of crying that you can't perform or manage, that just moves through you like weather. I thought about my father. I thought about him building things, saving things, setting aside 2 properties with the quiet confidence that his daughters would be okay when he was gone. I thought about my mother in her last months, frail and worried, and I thought about someone, my sister, sitting beside her and feeding her fears instead of easing them, and the grief and the fury were so tangled together I couldn't tell them apart. I sat on that floor for a long time. And then I got up. I washed my face. I put the kettle on. I sat down at the table and I opened my laptop and I wrote a list, methodical, precise, of everything I still had, everything I still knew, everything that was still mine. My firm, barely breathing but still breathing. My documentation, complete and organized. My mind, which worked, which was still working even when everything hurt. My patience, which is something I have always had in abundance, the kind of patience that doesn't come from peace but from understanding that the right moment is worth waiting for. I had no idea yet what I was waiting for. I just knew I wasn't done. The unexpected thing came from the most ordinary direction. Her name was Patricia, and she was 74 years old and had been my mother's closest friend for 32 years. I'd seen her at the funeral. Of course I had, but in the chaos of grief and the beginning of the legal nightmare, we hadn't really spoken. About 14 months after my mother died, Patricia called me out of the blue and asked if I would have coffee with her.
Just coffee.
I almost said no. I was depleted. I was suspicious of everyone connected to my mother's world because I'd learned that Celeste had been working those relationships carefully. But something in Patricia's voice was different. Something tentative but deliberate, like someone who has decided to say something they've been holding for a long time. We sat at a table near the window in a coffee shop near her apartment. She was a small, neat woman with white hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, and she stirred her coffee for a long time before she spoke. Then she said, "Your mother talked to me about Celeste." At the end, the real conversations, not the ones with the flowers and the visits. I put down my cup. Patricia told me that in the final weeks, my mother had begun to have doubts. That she had told Patricia she was afraid she'd made a terrible mistake. That Celeste had told her things, shown her things, that had seemed frightening at the time, but that she'd started to wonder if she'd been seeing the whole picture. That she'd asked Patricia once, quietly, whether Patricia thought I was the kind of person who would steal. And Patricia had said, firmly, no. She said my mother had cried. Then Patricia reached into her bag and placed a small envelope on the table between us. She told me my mother had given it to her 3 weeks before she died. She said my mother told her to keep it safe and give it to me if she ever felt it was the right time. Patricia said she'd been holding it for over a year, trying to understand whether giving it to me would help or hurt, watching from a distance as the legal battle unfolded. She said she was giving it to me now because she'd watched long enough. I picked up the envelope. My mother's handwriting on the front. Just my name. Hannah. I opened it there at the table. My mother had written 2 pages, handwritten. The letters a little unsteady but legible, dated about 3 weeks before her death. She wrote that she thought she had made a terrible mistake. She wrote that Celeste had brought her documents, withdrawal records, and told her that I was draining the account for my own use, that I was planning to take money from the estate as well. She wrote that she had been frightened and not thinking clearly and had agreed to see an attorney Celeste had arranged. She wrote that she'd been angry at me in a way that now she wasn't sure was real. And then she wrote something that made me have to set the paper down for a moment and breathe. She wrote, "I know Hannah has always been the one who stayed. I know that in my bones, even when my brain was full of fear. I'm not sure I treated her fairly. I'm not sure about a lot of things. But I know that if I was wrong, I want her to know that I see what she did for me, and I am grateful, and I love her, and I'm sorry." The handwriting got shakier at the end. She'd signed it just her name.
Mom.
I sat with Patricia in that coffee shop for a long time. Patricia held my hand across the table. This small woman I'd known peripherally for my whole life, and she let me be as broken as I needed to be in that moment. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" And I thought about that carefully, because the letter, the handwritten letter, was something. It was real, it was precious, it was the thing I'd needed for 18 months just to feel sane again. But whether it was enough legally, I didn't know. And I thought about something else Patricia had said, almost in passing, as she'd slid the envelope across the table. She'd said, "Celeste arranged the attorney. She knew Martin Greer before your mother ever did." I turned that sentence over very slowly in my mind. I went back to my attorney. I brought the letter, I brought what Patricia had said, and I asked him a very specific question. If Celeste had orchestrated the contact with the probate attorney, had selected him, had been the one to initiate the process of changing the will, not just influencing my mother but actively directing the legal mechanism, what would that mean? He used the phrase undue influence. He used it carefully and precisely, the way lawyers use words that have specific legal weight. He said this, combined with the letter and Patricia's testimony and the documentation I already had, was the foundation of a real case. Not just a dispute about the validity of the receipts. A case about whether the will itself had been produced through manipulation and fraud. I called Patricia that evening and asked if she would be willing to provide a sworn statement and testify if it came to that. She said, without any hesitation, "I've been waiting for someone to ask me." And then I started being very, very quiet. I won't explain what I mean by that, because this part of the story, the year that followed, is the part people want to skip over, the part that doesn't have obvious drama, but it's actually the most important part. Everything that happened later was built on what I did in that year of quiet. I withdrew from the public legal posturing. My attorney and I made a calculated decision to stop pushing hard on the main case, to let the momentum stall, to let Celeste believe that I was running out of money and running out of options and running out of fight. I knew how she thought. I knew she needed to believe she'd won in order to become careless. And she did become careless. Because that's what happens when you believe you've won. You relax.
You talk.
You stop watching your edges. I hired a private investigator. Not for anything dramatic, just to observe. To document. To confirm what I already suspected, which was that the relationship between Celeste and Martin Greer was not simply professional. They had a history. He had done work for her before, under a different firm name. There were professional connections that predated my mother's illness by years, which meant when Celeste told my mother she'd found a good attorney to help her update her will, she was lying. She'd brought in her own person. Beyond that, the investigator found something I hadn't anticipated, which shifted the entire shape of what I was building. Martin Greer had done this before. Not with my family, with another family 3 years earlier, a widower whose adult children had contested a will change that had occurred under very similar circumstances, involving a new attorney appearing late in the process and a new beneficiary who turned out to have had a prior relationship with that attorney. That case had settled quietly and confidentially, which meant it had never become public, but the court documents were accessible, and the pattern was there for anyone looking for it. I had someone looking for it. I also spent that year rebuilding what I could. My firm, I made a decision in month 1 of that year to stop letting it bleed. I took a smaller studio space, let one of my junior designers go with good references and real regret, kept the other, and focused entirely on the clients I could serve well. I started sleeping again, mostly. I started cooking real meals, which sounds trivial, but was not. I started running in the mornings, which is the kind of thing that sounds like self-help advice, and turns out to actually work, infuriatingly. I did not start dating, and I did not call David, though I thought about doing both things. What I was, in that year, was patient. I was building something. I was building it brick by brick, and every brick was a piece of documentation or a piece of testimony or a piece of legal strategy, and the structure I was building was one that Celeste wouldn't see coming because she believed, as she always had, as she'd been encouraged to believe her whole life, that she was smarter than me. I'd always let her. Not anymore. 15 months into the quiet year, my attorney filed an amended complaint. It was different in scope and character from what I had filed before. It named Celeste and Martin Greer together. It alleged fraud. It alleged undue influence. It presented the pattern evidence, the other family, the other contested will, as evidence of a scheme rather than an isolated incident. It included Patricia's sworn statement. It included my mother's letter, authenticated by a handwriting expert. It included the financial documentation I'd been accumulating for 2.5 years. And then it included something I'd gotten 3 weeks before filing, which was the thing that woke me up at 4 in the morning when I thought about it, the thing that made my hands shake with something other than fear. Martin Greer had a business partner. Had, past tense, they dissolved the partnership acrimoniously about 8 months before all of this started. His former partner had been sitting on something for years, something she decided not to act on because it would have required her to implicate herself as well, which was complicated and costly and difficult. But my investigator had found her, and she was, after some careful conversations, willing to talk. What she told us was that Greer had a practice, a pattern, of approaching elderly clients in their final illness through intermediary family members who stood to benefit, and guiding will changes in exchange for a fee arrangement that never appeared on any official document. It was careful. It was subtle. It was, in its own dark way, sophisticated. And it had worked multiple times because the people who might have contested it were grieving and exhausted and didn't have the resources or the endurance to push hard enough or long enough. He had, in a very real sense, made a business of it. The week my attorney filed the amended complaint, I sat in my small office in the studio space, and I thought about my mother in those last months, frightened, sick, trusting the wrong person because the wrong person was her daughter, and she hadn't been able to imagine that her own child would do this. I thought about her writing that letter in handwriting that had gone unsteady, trying to unsay what she'd done. I thought about her asking Patricia whether she thought I was the kind of person who would steal, and Patricia saying no. I thought. She knew. In the end, underneath all the fear and the confusion and the manipulation, she knew. I thought about my father, who had held those two properties quietly and steadily for decades, who had never once said, "This is for you," but had meant it anyway. I thought, this is for all of it.
For all of them.
And for me. I need to tell you about 2 weeks before the hearing because this is where the second turn came, the one I didn't see coming. I was at my attorney's office for a preparation meeting when his assistant knocked on the door and handed him a note. He read it. His expression shifted in a way that was hard to read. He said, "Give me a minute." And he stepped out, and when he came back and he sat down and looked at me and said, very carefully, "Celeste filed for bankruptcy protection this morning." I stared at him. He explained. One of the properties, the larger one, the one that had been generating rental income, had been heavily leveraged by Celeste in the 2 years since she'd taken ownership. She'd borrowed against it significantly, and the loan had been structured in a way that triggered under the current interest rate environment, and she was now in a financial position that was, to put it gently, catastrophic. The rental property wasn't generating enough to service the debt. The other property, the smaller commercial one, was the only asset she had left, and it was now tangled up in both the bankruptcy proceedings and my lawsuit. I sat with that information for a long time, without speaking. My attorney looked at me carefully and said, "This complicates things procedurally, but it also, and I want you to think about this carefully, it changes what you can actually recover. The property you're fighting for may not be worth what it was. We need to recalibrate what a good outcome looks like." I heard him. I understood him. And I also sat there thinking about something I hadn't expected to feel, which was a strange, complicated thing that was not quite satisfaction and not quite sorrow, but lived somewhere in the space between them. Celeste had taken 2 pieces of real estate that my father had tended for 30 years with modest, careful pride, and in less than 2 years she had managed to destroy half of it. She'd done what she always did, taken the thing that was given to her and used it like a tool rather than a trust, extracted what she could quickly rather than stewarding what was there. I thought, this was always going to happen. Even if I'd never filed, even if I'd walked away, she would have done this anyway. And suddenly the legal fight felt less like a battle for the properties and more like what it had always actually been, a fight for the record, a fight for the truth of what happened. I told my attorney, let's proceed. Whatever we recover financially, let's proceed. The hearing was not a trial exactly. It was a civil proceeding in a probate court, which is less dramatic than television makes courtrooms appear, but which carried its own specific gravity. Celeste was there with her attorney, a sharp-faced man who had been confident in their early filings and who looked, when I entered with my attorney and 2 bankers' boxes of documentation, slightly less confident. Martin Greer was there separately, represented by different counsel, and he looked like a man who had spent several months making contingency plans and was now sitting very still waiting to see which ones he'd need. Patricia was there. She was sitting in the gallery when I came in, and she caught my eye, and she nodded just once, just slightly, and I felt something move in my chest. I'm not going to walk you through every procedural moment of that hearing, because that's not actually the story. The story is what happened when our motion was argued, when the pattern evidence was introduced, when Patricia gave her statement, when Greer's former partner, appearing via video, gave her testimony with a careful, measured directness of someone who has decided that the truth is the only protection she has left. But let me tell you about Celeste. She sat at her side of the courtroom for most of the morning with the same composed expression she had always had, the same posture, the cream blazer version of herself who had looked at me across Martin Greer's desk 2.5 years ago and told me not to make this harder than it needs to be. Her attorney argued competently. He challenged the admissibility of the handwritten letter. He challenged Patricia's age and her relationship to the deceased as factors affecting her reliability. He challenged the relevance of the pattern evidence involving the other family. He was good, but our documentation was better. The moment that I will carry for the rest of my life came when the judge, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses and the manner of someone who has seen a very large number of people behave badly, turned to look directly at Celeste and asked her a very simple question. She asked, "Miss Celeste, can you explain the nature of your prior professional relationship with Mr. Greer before he was retained in connection with your mother's estate?" Celeste's attorney started to speak, and the judge raised one hand without looking at him, still watching Celeste. Celeste sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "We had a casual professional acquaintance. Nothing significant." The judge looked back down at her papers. She said, quietly, "The filings before me suggest that Mr. Greer's firm completed substantial estate work for you personally in 2017, including a trust arrangement, billed at a rate that included what appears to be a referral credit. Does that sound like a casual acquaintance to you?" The silence that followed was not dramatic in the movie sense. No one gasped. Celeste's face didn't crumble, but something went out of it, some quality of certainty, some architecture of composure that had held up for 2.5 years, and I watched it go, and I felt something I had not expected. Not triumph exactly. Not the satisfaction of revenge in its cleanest form. Something more complicated. Something that ached even as it resolved. She had known what she was doing. She had known every step of the way. She had chosen it clearly and deliberately, and some part of me would never entirely understand how we had come from the same place, the same back seat on the same Sundays, the same parents, the same family table, and arrived here. The judge's ruling came 3 weeks later, in writing, and I will tell you its essential content. The 2019 Will Amendment was found to have been procured under undue influence and through a relationship of undisclosed conflict of interest. It was invalidated. The estate would revert to the terms of the 2015 will, my father's original terms, under which the properties were to be sold and the proceeds divided equally. Martin Greer faced a separate bar complaint, initiated by the court on the basis of the hearing record. His license was suspended pending investigation. The family, who had settled quietly years before, when they heard what had happened, chose to reopen their own inquiry. Celeste received her half. I want to be clear about that. I didn't take her portion. I didn't try to. The judge's ruling gave me back what was mine. Not more.
Just mine.
The properties were sold during a real estate market that was somewhat lower than 2 years prior, and after fees and costs and everything else, what I received was considerably less than what I might have received if none of this had happened. But it was mine, and the record said it was mine, and my mother's letter was part of that record. There is no dramatic ending scene between Celeste and me. We have not spoken since the hearing. I don't imagine we will for a long time, if ever. I know people expect there to be a moment, a confrontation in a parking lot, a phone call, a reckoning between sisters in the way that movies show it, with words that finally say everything. But that moment didn't come. Maybe it never will. What I've learned, which is one of the harder lessons of my adult life, is that some things don't get a proper ending. They just get a stopping point. The wound doesn't close with a speech. It closes slowly and imperfectly, the way actual wounds do. I bought a house. Not a large one, not a grand one, a small one, with a garden in the back that had been badly neglected by the previous owners and needed significant work. I knew when I walked through it that I was going to take it. I started working on the garden myself, not just designing it, but doing the physical work. And there's something I have never adequately explained to anyone about what that feels like, to put your hands in dirt and arrange living things and watch, over weeks and months, what grows. The firm is doing better. I took on a new junior designer, A young woman named Priya, who is sharp and funny and occasionally infuriating and reminds me pleasantly of who I was when I was starting out. I got 2 new clients in the spring following the hearing, one of which is the largest project I've ever undertaken. I sleep through the night most nights now. I went to my mother's grave in October, the first autumn after the ruling. I hadn't been able to go before. The grief had been too tangled up in the anger, and I hadn't trusted myself to visit without the tangle overwhelming the grief. But I went in October, on an ordinary weekday, and I brought dahlias because my mother had always grown them in her garden and considered them underrated. I sat beside the grave for a while, and I said some things out loud that I won't repeat here, because they were just between us. I told her I understood. I told her that fear does complicated things to people, and that being old and sick and frightened is a specific kind of vulnerability that can be exploited by people who know you well and love you badly. I told her that I didn't think she was weak. I told her I knew she knew me, in the end. I told her the letter she wrote, the 2 shaky pages, the apology she gave to Patricia to hold, was the thing that made it possible for me to keep going when I had almost stopped. I also told her that I was still angry.
I want to be honest about that.
The love and the anger aren't mutually exclusive, and I've spent enough of my life trying to tidy up emotions that resist tidying. I was angry at her for listening to Celeste. I was angry at her for not asking me directly. I was angry at years of Sunday visits and flower arrangements being weighted the same as midnight pharmacy runs and medical spreadsheets, and every night I gave up and everything I put aside. I was angry at all of it, standing there with dahlias in the October light. But beneath the anger, still, was the love. Underneath everything, still, the love. David and I had coffee once, about 6 months after the ruling. It was pleasant and a little sad, the way some things are when they've moved fully into the past. He looked good. He said I looked good. Neither of us was lying. We didn't talk about the legal case much. He'd followed it at a distance and said only that he was glad it had come out the way it did. We did not discuss getting back together, and I did not want to. What I felt for him in that coffee shop was something warm and finished, like a book you loved that you've already read. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that the resolution of this story is not a triumphant montage. It's not a clean before and after. What happened to me took 3 years and cost me my engagement and nearly my business and a significant portion of my mental health. I won in the technical and legal sense, and the winning mattered. The truth being part of the record mattered. My father's intention being honored mattered. But I didn't walk away from it unscathed, and anyone who tells you that surviving something like this leaves you stronger in every way is skipping over the parts where you're just left different, altered in ways you didn't choose, carrying weight that doesn't come from anything you did wrong. What I know about myself now that I didn't know before, I am more patient than I realized and more stubborn, and both of those things are capable of being weaponized when necessary. I know that I can keep going in the dark, through months of uncertainty and loss, without knowing how it ends. I know that the person I've always been, the responsible one, the one who keeps the receipts, the one who stays, is not the lesser role. It never was. I spent a long time believing, in a place I wouldn't have admitted, that Celeste's kind of person was the one worth being. Warm and charming and effortlessly wanted. I believed that my version of love, steady, administrative, showing up for the hard parts, was a lesser love. Less visible, less valued. I don't believe that anymore. Patricia came to see my garden in July. She arrived with a bottle of wine and a pair of gardening gloves that she insisted on using, despite my protests, while I gave her the tour. She is the kind of person who asks genuine questions and actually listens to the answers, and she walked through that overgrown space and asked me about each plant, what it was when I'd put it in, what it would do in another year. It was an ordinary afternoon. It was the kind of ordinary afternoon that I had almost forgotten to want. She said at one point, standing in the middle of the garden with her wine glass and her gloves, "Your mother would have liked this." I thought about that for a long time after she left. She would have. My mother, who had dahlias and opinions about soil, who had been frightened and manipulated and who had tried, imperfectly and perhaps too late, to tell the truth anyway, who had put 2 pages in an envelope and given them to a friend to hold, who had done the small, brave, imperfect thing of writing my name on the front. She would have liked this garden. I still think about Celeste. I won't pretend otherwise. I think about her more than I wanna, and not always with anger, sometimes with something like grief, because she is my sister and I had, for most of my life, loved her. The version of her that I loved was real. Even if the version of her that sat across from me in a cream blazer and said not to make this harder than it needs to be was also real. People contain both things. That is one of the most difficult facts of being alive. I don't know what her life looks like now. The bankruptcy proceedings were ongoing when I stopped monitoring them. I know the financial damage to the first property was her doing entirely, and I know what that means about how she lives with money and with things that are given to her. I hope, in a way that surprises me sometimes when I notice it, that she eventually finds a way to be different. Not for my sake. Just because the alternative, the life of someone who does what she did, who is capable of feeding fears into a dying woman's ear, that life is its own punishment, and it was going to catch up with her with or without me. I just happened to be the one who made sure the catching up was documented. There is something I've thought about a great deal in the past year, which is the question of what I was actually fighting for. The money mattered, not as wealth but as security, as the thing my father had intended, as the foundation he'd tried to give me. But somewhere in the 3 years, it stopped being primarily about the money. It became about the record. It became about the version of events that would be the official version, the one that would survive. Because Celeste's plan had been not just to take the inheritance, but to take the story. To be the version of events. To have the world, my family's world, our small circle, understand me as the greedy one, the suspicious one, the one who drained our sick mother's account. She had wanted to take what I was owed, and also take who I was. That is a particular kind of theft. It's the kind that leaves you not just poor, but unrecognizable to yourself. And that, more than anything, is what I got back. I stood up off a kitchen floor one night and made a list of what I still had. And then I spent 3 years adding to that list, quietly, patiently, one document and one statement and one true piece of evidence at a time, and at the end of it I walked into a courtroom and the record said what was true. My father's intent was honored. My mother's letter is part of a court record. Martin Greer answered for what he did. The version of Hannah that Celeste had tried to write is not the version that exists in the official account. I am the one who kept the receipts. I always was. The garden is coming in well this spring. I put in dahlias along the back fence, deep red ones, the kind my mother grew. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because they're beautiful. Maybe because some things you inherit that have nothing to do with property. Maybe because I am still, in ways I'm still figuring out, my mother's daughter, and that is both complicated and simply, stubbornly true. I go out in the early morning before work sometimes and just stand in it. The garden. The thing I'm building, the living thing that keeps going because I tend it. And I think about my father setting aside 2 properties with quiet pride, and my mother writing 2 pages with an unsteady hand, and Patricia sliding an envelope across a coffee shop table, and my own hands pressing flat against cold kitchen tile on the worst night, and then washing my face and putting the kettle on. I think about all of it, and then I go inside, and I work. Here is what I know. After everything, the people who take from you are counting on you to be too tired to take it back. They're counting on the grief and the expense and the slow erosion of believing you deserve to fight. What they don't account for, what Celeste never accounted for, is that the person who stays, the one who shows up for the hard parts, who keeps the receipts, who sits with the dying and maintains the spreadsheets and loves in the unglamorous ways, that person knows something about endurance that the person who only shows up for the beautiful parts will never understand. She took 3 years from me, and I took back the truth. And the truth, it turns out, is the only inheritance that no one can spend.